So I'm sure you've heard of HbA1c. It's a marker that you might have seen on your blood work, and it's actually a very interesting marker and a very useful tool to see whether or not you have, pre-diabetes or a likelihood to develop actual diabetes. So what exactly is HbA1c? Well, essentially it's a marker to see how much actual glucose that's in your bloodstream, or sugar, has actually attached to your red blood cells. And this is a really interesting way to test it because we have a certain amount of time in which our red blood cells will actually survive, and that's about 120 days. So what they can do is test just how much sugar has actually attached to those red blood cells throughout their life cycle. The reason this marker on blood work is actually quite useful and quite accurate is because when we think of our red blood cells, they're made up of hemoglobin, right? So this hence is why it's called HbA1c. Hb is heme. So the heme component that makes up the red blood cells has parts in it that are made of lysine, which is a certain amino acid. Now what's really interesting is glucose in the blood has a very high affinity to these lysine components. So essentially they like to bond together. And when they do bond, they form really strong bonds. And essentially once they have bonded, they won't break again. So another really interesting thing about this lysine to glucose bond is that it happens non-enzymatically. So essentially we don't need special enzymes around in order to make this bond occur, which will mean that as long as there is lysine present and glucose present, this bond is likely to occur. So if you think about it logically, the more glucose or sugar that you have in your bloodstream over the life cycle of 120 days, or the life cycle of a red blood cell, the more is going to bond with the hemoglobin and the higher your HbA1c percentage will be. And what they like to see is that your HbA percentage is under about 5%. If you think about it, over your total blood volume, if around 5% or under is actually glycated, then this is a good thing. It means that your sugar levels are quite low. But if it's over 5%, it means that you've got a lot of sugar in your bloodstream most of the time. But why is this a problem? Why do we care about the fact that we have sugar glycated or attached to our hemoglobin? Well, once this sugar has attached to the hemoglobin, it actually can form something called an AGE, or AGE. And this is able to actually bind onto a very special receptor called a RAGE receptor, R-A-G-E receptor. And this will essentially in a cell cause it to produce more reactive oxygen species, which is essentially free radicals. Another really interesting thing about this is that it can also, these glycated end products can also bind on to immune cells and essentially increase their inflammatory activity. So increase the production of more reactive oxygen species, increase their ability to migrate to certain areas of the body and things like that. We can also then bind them onto our LDL particles and make them work not very well and dysfunctional, which can lead to atherosclerosis. Sorry, it's a bit dark now. I just wanted to also point out that you can decrease your HbA1c percentage relatively quickly. Now, as I said, once these bonds have formed between the sugar, the glucose, and the lysine on the hemoglobin, that bond won't be broken. But the interesting thing is each red blood cell will live only really around 120 days and then it dies off. It can't be used anymore. And it will then be replaced by a new little baby red blood cell, and these won't be glycated. So if you reduce your sugar intake and reduce the amount of glucose that's always in your bloodstream, then of course you can decrease your HbA1c relatively quickly and around 120 days.